Okay, yes, so I'm Jessica Symons. I'm an anthropologist and also an entrepreneur. I have a background in entrepreneurship. I was an IT consultant for many years. Then I did a PhD in anthropology on creative processes and idea development and culture, and worked in the universities of Salford and Manchester for a few years doing research into creative processes. And then I saw the immersive sector, AR, VR, start to really blow up. And I saw an opportunity and decided to start a business. So this is my business. I don't know if you can see. It's called Visioning Lab. And what happened was I decided to make a business, but I wasn't quite sure exactly what I was going to do with it. I just knew I wanted to make something in the AR, augmented and virtual reality space. Does everybody here know what augmented and virtual reality is? Yes. Okay. So it's this is an example of it. So you have here in the background, you have the world, you have an image here, and we have an app called Pop-Up View, which pops up 3D content. That's one representation of augmented reality. It's literally augmenting reality. And virtual reality is where you are fully immersed in a world, a digital world, which you view through a headset. And I'll talk a bit more about that in a minute. So what we're doing is exploring and developing ideas in this space, working with different people. So it's very reactive. As people come my way and are interested in collaborating and it works, then we develop ideas together. Some catch, some don't, and it's just this iterative process of collaboration, which I find really exciting and builds on my research as into creative processes, the zigzag of creative development. But I'm bringing all my experience of the private sector into actually developing a business, registering it. I have a business partner now who has a background in IT, so putting in the infrastructure that you need to run a private business. This is what we've been doing over the past year. I've made 8 apps, all based on the same principle of this popping up of 3D content based on an image. I've run workshops. I'm based at the Landing now at Media City, which has an AR, VR lab, an immersive lab. If anybody wants to come and see me there, I run workshops once a month, and I'm there once a week for discussions and collaborations. It's a really great space because it has, we have 5 or 6 headsets, VR headsets in this large room with some very powerful computers, so you can just come in and play and make. And it's in a nice setting in Media City, so we can go out into the keys and explore and develop ideas. And in fact, I'll tell you about this in a minute, but in December we actually put this groups of people app out into the keys as part of an experience. So what happened was in the process of all these different kinds of conversations I was having, there was a lot of excitement about the simplicity of the pop-up, the 3D content, the digital overlay. You have an image and you open up your phone, you open up the app, it opens your camera, you hover your phone over the image, and a 3D object, an animated object, materializes. And at the same time, we also discovered a very easy process of making the 3D content, which was drawing in virtual reality using this tool called Google Tilt Brush, which is, I think it costs about £20 to download. The history of it is, it was actually created by these 2 French guys who were working out how to annotate a chess game in VR. So they had this 3D chess game, and they were working out how to draw an arrow to point out moves. And so they created this bit of tech to draw in VR, and then they realized that actually that was their product. And they got bought by Google and resourced to develop it into a piece of software, which is now being used by thousands of people. There's a big community of people who've built up a community of artists who've built up around this tool, which is, you know, when you play with sparklers on bonfire night and it creates light, well, that's what Google Tilt Brush does. You draw with light, lots of different colors, lots of different kinds of brushes, which are animated, they move. And the year before last, I went round Cheshire with a VR headset and this piece of software, Tilt Brush, and I went into libraries around Cheshire and I gave people a go on this kit. And people from, I think my oldest was in their 80s, my youngest was, well, you're not supposed to let kids younger than 13 have a look, so officially my youngest was 13 for VR, but everybody just got it immediately. Within 30 seconds, I set myself this challenge of within 30 seconds, pretty much anyone is drawing in VR with this kit from never having used VR before. It's very quick and very easy. The first AR app I built actually was in Unity, and it was because I'd been talking to a professor at MMU who's been working in digital sculpture called Keith Brown. And he has a very interesting story in the sense that he has been making this really beautiful 3D work in 3D Studio Max for 20 years, well, not necessarily just Studio Max, but lots of different tools. So he was around in the early days of the development of 3D software, and he's been making work ever since. But people never really saw what was special about the fact that his work was 3D because they only ever saw it in 2D. Yeah, so when they looked at it on a computer screen, they couldn't appreciate that the thing that he had made was 3D. So then augmented and virtual reality come along. You can put on a headset or you can use AR to pop up the 3D essence of these artworks that he's created, which are really beautiful. And so he made this one for me to make an AR app out of, but he insisted it was a sketch. It's not a proper artwork because he did it very quickly. So what's really interesting about this is the integrity that comes into making work in a 3D environment for him is as important in the digital space as it is in the physical space, which I'm sure is something that you understand as musicians, that the thoughtfulness that goes into it. But he has found over the years that he hasn't got that level of respect because people aren't really understanding the approach that he's taking in the making in the digital world is informed by all the art practices and principles of the physical world. His work is referencing Henry Moore and that sort of modernist era, but in a digital realm. So this was the app that we made. We got people to come to the Lowry. We ran open studio sessions over 6 weeks. People turned up and we looked at pictures of, so Lowry is a very famous painter. He painted in the 19th century scenes in Salford of people walking to factories. You might have seen them. There's like, you see a picture of a factory, they're called matchstick people, and there's lots of little sort of people walking into the factory. And he was one of the first artists to depict this industrializing era that was happening in the UK and worldwide. And so we looked at the paintings that he had made, and then visitors then responded to that by creating their own work in VR. So it was bringing that understanding of art practice, that understanding of response to people's works and putting it into a digital space. And at the same time, and these are around if you want to try them out later, the trigger images were made by an artist called Amber McCormack, who came in and created a set of photo montages. So we put, again, a lot of thought into what's this trigger image that is used to load up the 3D objects, and how does that stand as an artwork in itself. And at the same event, this was an art festival that was run by Keys Culture, who manage cultural events at in Salford Quays. Keith, also the artist who did the sketch, he has these 3D works that he's been making, which are you can just, I mean, you can barely get a sense of it there, but imagine you go inside this space, yeah? It's this very complicated set of shapes and colors that you go through and around, and so you can move in the VR space through them. And they're, think of them as sheaves. So as you walk into it, you walk through and out the other side, and then you see another world of color and shape. So it's very exciting, his work, and it's very exciting working with Keith. And as I said, I'm also discovered that in the process of making these AR apps, I've now got a process that works very quickly. So we can make an AR app in a day. So you can come to the lab, you can draw in VR, draw some interesting shape, or you can bring a 3D object that you've already created. If you want to put music in, you can incorporate that. We can go through the process. I've got it all set up so that we can actually walk out with an AR app at the end, which you can have on your phone to show other people. So one of the things that I'm really excited about what we're doing is this democratizing of the app making process, that everyone can have their own app with their own content on it, which you can also do in other contexts, but this is in the AR, VR world. The other thing that we did that I just want to mention, because it's another way of visualizing and another way of thinking about these things, is we took a physical map and we put a 3D element into it so that it could pop out. And we put some animation into it so that when you touch on one of these 3D elements, it will show you the route. The request for this one, this was commissioned, was they had meetings in different places for a course that they were running, and they wanted to show exactly which building it was on the map and how to get there from the public transport and the car parks. Now you might say, well, can't you just look on Google? A lot of people actually struggle with conceptualizing the 2D plane of a Google map into 3D, and this was a sort of proposition, a way of maybe helping people who have those kinds of challenges. So why am I doing this? What am I reflecting on in the process of doing this? Is something which underlies the running of the company, because I've spent time thinking about the world and how it works as an academic, but also as an activist. I'm interested in, I've sort of broken it up into these three different elements. So I'm interested in how ideas happen, how creative processes work, and the sort of research interest I have around that is this movement that we're going from 2D to 3D in terms of our making practice, but actually really we are just returning to 3D, and that it's 2D, the 2D plane of pieces of paper, books, and screens are actually a medium that we have is actually quite new for us as human beings. I also am interested in futures thinking, so where are we going and how are we going to get there, and what kinds of processes and ways can we engage people to help them think about those kinds of issues. And because I have come from IT and I've been in IT for a long time, one of the things that really concerned me was I was in a new tech team when the internet happened. We were looking at portals, mobile phones, smart cards, e-commerce, and I saw what happened and was part of what then happened over the past 20 years where it all just exploded. And what I can see is the same things happening with augmented and virtual reality and this, what's now being called spatial computing, this idea that we are now in a world where the digital is all around you rather than just actually controlled by the screen, which you can close, you can put away. What does that then mean for our social dynamic and the amount of control people will have over these digital elements? And there's lots of really weird stuff that's coming out of the people who are making things in this AR, VR world. There's lots of really quite freaky things that I find unsettling. Like, for example, there was one the other day where somebody had made a hand, like a virtual hand, that had another little hand at the end of each of the fingers. And it was just on Twitter, and I just looked at this hand with these little hands on the end, and there was something about it which I found really unsettling. I don't know why. And then my son pointed out that there's this phobia people can have for small holes. Are you aware of this small hole phobia? I wasn't. But there's this danger that we have now, which is as people become more and more drawn into this blended digital world, that all sorts of hidden instincts and phobias that we might have that we didn't realize we had have the potential to emerge. And then if you're designing for those kinds of spaces, how do you know what kinds of reactions people are going to have to things if they are to some extent hidden? So motion sickness, for example, is very well known in virtual reality to be a problem. A lot of people feel motion sick when they put the headset on. So that's being controlled and managed by the design teams. But what about all those other hidden things that you aren't really aware of until they happen? And you might not know about them if it's only a very small proportion of people who have that problem. So one of the reasons why I'm in this AR, VR community is because I want to have an influence over how it develops. And I also have this aspiration, which to some extent drives me, which is around, is it possible to live in a natural world where we get to see trees and grass and flowers every day as part of our day-to-day routine, at the same time as having this digital layer that sits alongside our world. So my aspiration actually is to think about how we can go from the constraints of chairs and laptops and desks and computers and this kind of hunched sore arms and backs that we're in at the moment. Is it possible to go and not to go back to a time where we all just rode horses around and lived in grass huts, but incorporate that sensibility of being closer to nature and part of nature, whilst at the same time having this highly sophisticated digital infrastructure that we have around us. So one of the first things I want to observe is that, as I mentioned previously, the notion of 3D is actually ancient. You know, as human beings, we've been working and thinking spatially right up until the Industrial Revolution, when people started reading books in mass printing, and then from books we went on to computer screens, which is where we are now. But actually, rather than thinking about us going to 3D from 2D, we're actually going back to 3D in terms of our spatial understanding and our spatial awareness. And this was one of the things that I realized, is that have we, in thinking in 2D, over maybe 5 generations, in terms of engaging with computer screens and books, have we actually disabled ourselves to some degree in thinking spatially? And one of the reasons why I came to that view was because when I was asking people to draw in virtual reality, so in VR, when you draw using tilt brush, you draw like this because you're drawing in 3D. So when you draw a cube, I would say to people, draw a cube. They would draw a cube like they draw a square, and then they would draw a line coming out from it, and then a line across and then down, and they'd make it look like a square that you see on a piece of paper. And I'd say, well, okay, we'll walk around it, and they go around it, and it's just one flat plane. It's like, no, now draw a real cube that, like you see in the world. So then it's very straightforwardly, most people will manage to draw a cube after some prompting. But what's interesting is that their first instinct is to draw something on a 2D plane. And what does that mean? Now, of course, there are many people who are still working in 3D. They have to think in 3D, but they're often planning their drawing in 2D. Yeah, so they will sketch out what they're going to make, or if it's complicated, this is an engineering, building massive engineering project, then it will be in CAD, but it will be in CAD on a computer screen. So that ability to think in 3D actually reduces to a much smaller group of people who can look at a 2D plan and interpret it into a 3D model, which is in their minds. And you talk to architects and people like that, they can do that, but a lot of people can't. And so the question then becomes, well, actually, if you give people a 3D entity to look at by using a headset or a device of some sort, then how many more people will be able to engage with 3D models than they can currently, because it's about being able to interpret a 2D image into a 3D model. Okay, so this is Gravity Sketch, and there are a number of tools now like this. This one's drawn, hand-drawn, but there are lots of tools now which are very structured. You can make it draw straight lines, you can make it draw cubes, you can bring in a CAD model, you can look at the model in 3D and then make additions to it. So these are the kinds of technologies which are very quickly going to be how people design. They're going to be making work and thinking about work in a 3D context. And also, so that was a headset, right? This isn't going to last very long. These funny-looking things where people are blind, that's a stage in the development of headsets. The next stage is really just glasses, which have an element, a digital overlay in it, so that you can see the world and the 3D object in front of you. And then it's going to be contact lenses. So imagine that. You've got a pair of contact lenses in, because at the end of the day, if you think about when we're seeing things, really the only information that's going in is what's going on to our eyes, right? So when screens started off, they were in the cinema, miles away, and then they became TVs, so they got a bit closer. Then they became computers, then they become phones, then they become glasses, then they become contact lenses, just completely. So our digital overlays will just cover our eyes. How do we feel about that? You know, that's something to really think about. The other element to think about as well is it's not just about the use of passing the imagery in via a screen that gets closer to your eyes. It's also that where projection is very well developed as a process. In fact, I found a musical reference, which I'm sure you all know about already. So being able to engage with light, there's a lot of work that's going into that. We won't actually need to have any kind of screen like this. You'll just have a projection onto a table, and you'll do all your typing, all your interacting with a electronic device will come from the tracking of your movement over the light that's projected onto it, rather than having to send a command into a keyboard. Which, of course, generates a question about the electronic waste that we currently have a huge problem with, is to what extent will the emergence of these technologies allow us to reduce on the waste and therefore achieve this world of pastoral idyls, but with this element, this digital element, this structures that are much more integrated into the natural world. And that's to some extent what drives me, is to what extent are the technologies and the tools and the steps that I'm taking and the work that I'm doing connected into these Sustainable Development Goals, which I find, they were developed by the UN. They're a really helpful structure to guide decision-making and projects that I design and activities that I do as part of my work. And so what we're doing now is we have a digital nature trail going on at the moment. The plan is for it's National Insect Week in June, and we're using the same principle. We're going to invite people to the lab to this is a wonderful project that's being done by the Digital Archive of Natural History. It's in Sketchfab, and they've released for free 3D digital models of insects that they've made from their collection. There's thousands of them, really beautiful, very detailed views. So we're going to take these insects, drop them into VR, have people come to the lab and draw their own versions of these insects. In the process of doing that, we'll be looking really closely at exactly how is this insect made, developing an appreciation of the natural world and its habitats, and then take their work, put them into the app with a trigger image developed by an artist or a series of trigger images, and put them around Manchester city centre so people can go on a trail and look for the insects, pop up the 3D objects, get some pleasure, but also learn from it at the same time. If you want to get involved in that, let me know. I'm always interested in bringing audio into these experiences. So that's me.
Thank you.
Okay.
So any questions, any thoughts? I have too many, so maybe just to pass it on to the floor. Anything you want to ask?
I always wonder how much AR and VR are like competing technologies. Do you think at some point they won't seem that way anymore, and it'll just be, as you say, some sort of unified technology that can do everything?
Yeah, it's for the right context. So you use the right tool in the right context. The analogy that I'm using for VR at the moment, which I find helpful, is, you know, a welder, when they weld pieces of metal together, they pull a hood down and they work very closely, and then they put their hood back up again. That's really the context that VR works best, is where you want to do some concentrated work in a place where you feel safe. And I think that one of the questions I have around, there's lots of things like VR cinema, where they have people in a room all with their headsets on. But what I found when I was going around the libraries was that there's all sorts of really practical things you need to think about when you're asking somebody to effectively blind themselves in a public space. What about their bag? You have to watch them. You have to watch their handbag, which is on the floor, and their shopping. And then what if they've got a kid? You know, do you have to watch their kid as well? Do you then say no to them because they've got a child? There's like all sorts of real problems with how VR is used in different contexts. And one of the reasons why I went down the AR route was to, because I didn't want to have to tackle those problems. The headsets are heavy, they're expensive, they're hard to put up, that kind of thing. But they're absolutely important now in places like the oil and gas sector, for deep sea diving, for anywhere where there's a dangerous activity, to be able to provide a virtual environment for people to test in before they're... Apparently McDonald's has a VR experience for using a chip fat fryer. And if you think about it, it's kind of, you know, the last thing you want to do is put a novice in front of, you know, a vat full of oil for the first time. But if they've done it 100 times in a VR experience and then they do it for real, then you're limiting your potential for injury. So yeah, I don't think they're competing at all. I think they're complementary.
I have one question. As you were talking about the technology becoming thinner, you know, from the headsets to the lens, I was thinking about this generation of people born in that era, like maybe in the next few years, that will only understand the world with these two things, like the physical world and the visual overlay, extending it.
Yeah.
And it reminded me the internet era when it started. You know, like a lot of people, millennials, for example, they don't understand that before the internet, there were people like didn't experience the internet.
Yeah.
So they conceive that as part of their understanding of the world. So the question is, what what do you think these people born in the next few years that will understand the world with these two layers of information on site will differ from us, for example?
Well, see, I have a bit of a concern around it because of the potential for obfuscation, you know, like the deep fakes. So it's to what extent will people feel like they can trust anything that they see if it's always the potential that there is a influence, some kind of malign influence that's involved in its production and it's trying to persuade or manipulate you. So we could potentially be producing people who have this underlying anxiety all the time about what's truth, you know, where is meaning. And I think we're seeing that to some degree with sort of social media and how people engage with social media now. But then at the same time, you've got people who will, in theory, be immediately informed about everything all the time. So this notion of not knowing anything will go away because you can always access information. So, and what I'm finding with young people that I work with is that they're highly sophisticated in their thinking, in their engagement with information, and very analytical, very emotionally engaged and sophisticated in their thinking. So it's not, I don't have a concern for what the next generation are going to do. I think the biggest challenge we have really is the gap. I think the gap is just getting bigger and bigger. We've got older people in their 80s who have no idea. And then we've got younger people who are really sophisticated. And I do wonder, I think that universities are actually a bit of a coalface for that situation because you have maybe quite a few older academics, you know, who maybe aren't engaged digitally. And then you get this younger generation who are just coming in, who are really switched on and expecting everything. So, you know, maybe from your experience, you're seeing a big divide here.
I'm not that old, I have to say.
I wasn't talking about you necessarily, as sort of other academics.
But I understand that, yeah. A lot of people are, you don't need to be old to not understand or maybe not have the will to engage with it. I'm the opposite. I'm really curious about technology. I have always been. But yes, I think students have a different expectation of that idea. I don't know. We resource it enough. In many aspects. I mean, I'm in the VR research group, the VR steering group at the university, and we do not believe the amount of differences we have in the steering group. People from medical scientists, to geographers, humanities people, artists, because this technology is everywhere. It addresses so many different issues and questions that everybody is interested. We still think that it's kind of an artistic tool that started that way and so on, but it's not. And the university is really embracing it very fast, very quickly.
And that's what happened with the internet. Yeah. And that's why I decided to set up a business, was because it was when I realized that every field is talking about it. Yeah. That's when you know something's going to go. Yeah. It's not niche anymore.